welcome back AP Psychers. In today's video, we are going to overview the April break application FRQ. The intent was to give you 8 bullets in 25 minutes. That is the exact format of the AP exam this year. The hope is that you completed as much as you could in those 25 minutes, marked in your FRQ where you stopped, and then continued onward to complete the material, hopefully giving you an opportunity to practice what it's going to be like in May. The first bullet was what we call state-dependent memory. This comes back all the way from Unit 1. I intentionally selected this bullet for a few different reasons. If you actually go into our material, I call this context-dependent memory. I really do try my best to give you as many synonyms as possible, but occasionally the College Board sneaks in a different name for a term where we might call it context-dependent memory and they call it state-dependent memory. This is a good example of that, so I'm hoping that many of you were able to look in your notes, look at the essential tasks that I suggested, and make this distinction. There are 2 different types of context-dependent memory, mood and location. The idea here is that if you study in one mood, if you were to be tested in that same mood, that would be of a benefit to you. You would be utilizing what's called context-dependent memory, and it would likely help you on a test. The other is location, where if you can study in the same location as the test, so that the location of studying and the location of testing are congruent or the same, that can also be of a benefit to you. This FRQ specifically wanted you to identify how these terms can help. However, it added some interesting context that made you have to apply it in a few different ways. If you look in the prompt, it says that Shamar is taking the test 3 hours away from where he lives, which means the location-dependent memory would have been a really challenging one. You theoretically could have said he visited the school where he was going to take this test and studied, then returned for the actual test in the same location. You could have said that and then stated how that would be of a benefit. I think that would be challenging and sort of logically, I don't know why you'd want to drive 3 hours out of your way like that, but theoretically that would have scored. I think it's more probable, though, to use the mood element of state or context-dependent memory, where if you study, let's say you're happy, and then you actually test in that same mood of being happy, you're more than likely going to remember the material that you studied, and in the context of this FRQ specifically, you would have a better time retrieving information about famous legal cases and other factual information that would be necessary to succeed on this standardized test. The second bullet is my favorite word, mnemonic. This year, the letter M symbol in blue has represented mnemonics. It's not inconceivable that you could see the term mnemonic device as a bullet. That has been a bullet before. Don't get confused by the word device. It's not a literal item. It's not a physical item or anything like that. It's just another way of describing mnemonics, which, as we know throughout the year, are memory tricks. There are a dozen plus different memory tricks that you could have referenced, many of which that we used this year. Maybe Shamar used the method of Loki, where you identify locations and then place information in each of those locations, sometimes called the journey method. If you described his use of the method of Loki, perhaps with those legal cases, that would work. Even just referencing the use of acronyms, that would also work as a sufficient explanation of what a mnemonic is. We've used acronyms all year. If you remember the proactive old, retroactive new, that's an example of an acronym mnemonic. You could think of visual pictures. We've had a few mnemonics this year where we've taken terms and thought about them as visuals. Remember, the pineal gland kind of looks like a bed. This is the gland that secretes melatonin, the hormone that helps put you to sleep. Kind of looks like, to me, a bed. So again, there are lots of different types of mnemonics that we've had throughout the year. If you referenced any memory trick and specifically identified how it would help, that would be sufficient to score. The third bullet could be a tricky one. The sympathetic nervous system could easily be an FRQ bullet, where instead of help, it asks how it could hinder, or it could ask how it affects, giving you the option of the direction in which you would go. However, this bullet asks you specifically how it helps. The sympathetic nervous system, again, is the aspect of the nervous system that amps you up. So you amped up, it increases your arousal, which would then translate to things like increased heart rate, breathing, sweating, etc. This is what's going to really put you in the zone and allow you to focus. And again, because this is a bullet that's asking you only how it helps. What you would need to say is that you are sufficiently aroused, which lets you focus on the test, which thus would allow Shamar to score highly. It is not inconceivable that you show up to a test and you're not sufficiently amped up, you're kind of tired, you're not focused, and you do poorly. If you were described being sufficiently aroused, not too amped up that you're making mistakes and you're nervous, that would certainly not help you on an exam. We're talking about aroused to the sufficient location, or the sufficient point. Although I referenced Unit 5 when I identified the essential task, it's not inconceivable that you remember what's called the Yerkes-Dodson law back from Unit 8. That was one of the last things that we did in class, or one of the very first things that you had to do at home. The Yerkes-Dodson law argues that for complex tasks, it's actually ideal to have lower levels of arousal so that you're sufficiently aroused but not too aroused. You could, in theory, get that into this FRQ where you state, this is a complex task, you want your sympathetic nervous system to have you a little bit aroused, but not too aroused. So that bullet, although not what we are stating here, could have been embedded into your answer. Since when you state this, sufficiently aroused, you really are stating the findings of a concept back from Unit 8. But it's important that you state very clearly something physiological, whether it's increased arousal, or you could be specific, increased heart rate, or breathing, or sweating, etc., and how that can allow you to focus and allow you to perform to the best of your ability without getting too amped up. The fourth bullet, crystallized intelligence, is actually a very common term on the AP exam. Crystallized intelligence, or its confusing pair, fluid intelligence, has appeared on the AP exam 3 times in about the last 15 years. So it's a useful one to practice. Crystallized intelligence is your intelligence of facts, just general information. Every single day you gain more crystallized intelligence, because in theory you're going to learn something factual, even if it is simple as what happened on April 28th. That's technically general factual information. So your crystallized intelligence increases every single day of your life. In the context of this study, this would be what allows you to know about those case studies, those legal case studies. It would allow you to know about the law and the legal ramifications of those case studies. And in theory, if you know a lot about those cases, know a lot about law, know about the legal system, if you simply have a lot of facts regarding the justice system as a whole, you would certainly do well on a standardized test about court cases and other things that are really simply factual information. So more crystallized intelligence, the better Shamar is going to score on this test. Specifically because he will be able to identify legal cases and apply them to the scenarios using his great general knowledge and broad base of facts. The 5th bullet is known as self-efficacy. This is another bullet that's actually pretty common on the AP exam. When you exhibit self-efficacy, this is the belief that you can succeed on a given task. Do not confuse this with self-esteem. That's a common confusing pair. Self-esteem is more of a holistic view of yourself. Self-efficacy is very precisely if you believe you can succeed on one very specific task. So, for example, Shamar might show up confident he will pass, which could ultimately help him avoid heightened nerves, which will subsequently allow him to focus and do well on the exam. Why? Because he has high self-efficacy. He showed up to the exam telling himself, I can do well on this, I've studied, I am confident in my ability. I believe I can succeed on this very specific task, the test in which he is taking. The 6th, 7th, and 8th bullets transition slightly in the question. It asks how the given terms can affect Shamar as he is scheduled to submit an essay and drop it off. The first term is what we call prospective memory. This is the memory for things in the future, meaning things that you plan on doing. So, for example, if you go home and tell yourself, I need to do my physics homework, and you fail to do your physics homework, that is specifically a failure of your prospective memory. So in the context of this, it can definitely help if Shamar schedules a time to write and does it. If he in fact plans, I am going to write the essay at this time, and then plans on doing it and actually succeeds, or whether that's the process of dropping it off. I'm not going to write that on the board here. But if he plans on dropping it off at a given time, he remembers to drop it off, and he successfully drops it off, that's obviously going to help him. You could very easily apply this the other way, though. If you want to say hurt, that's totally okay. If you are going to go approach it the other way, you could say he plans on dropping it off, but a failure of the prospective memory occurs, meaning you forget to drop it off, you never drop it off, the essay is late, the essay is not turned in. That's obviously going to hurt him in this given scenario. So prospective memory is memory to do things in the future. I plan on doing this. If you successfully do that, it's obviously going to help Shamar in the scenario. That would work. Or you could flip it to the other end. He fails to turn it in on time. He fails to write the essay. He fails to drop it off according to what he was planning on doing. The 7th bullet is easily one of the most important bullets of the entire year. Students have reported back from the actual AP exam and then our unit test having made a critical mistake when they've seen bullets like this. The Big 5 trait of conscientiousness is one of the 5 traits identified by McCrae and Costa. We use the mnemonic canoe in order to differentiate each of the 5. However, occasionally students will turn back and read this as consciousness. I know the words look similar, but they're different. And when you read this as consciousness, you might mistake the letter C and instead write about all 5 of the personality traits, or pick one, thinking that you are allowed to pick any of them. Neither of those things are true. Conscientiousness is specifically the letter C, which means you need to write somebody who's really organized, someone who's really well planned out. You need to talk about things like that. So in the context of this FRQ, if Shamar exhibits high conscientiousness, he would have a well-organized collection of notes, which then translates to a well-structured essay. Perhaps that well-structured essay is then submitted on time because he has a well-organized planner. Maybe his schedule, or his Google schedule, or his iPhone schedule, whatever it might be. It's well-structured, so he turns it in on time, just like he's planned. Everything goes well. Because, again, this FRQ is an effect, you could flip it around to the other end of it. You could say that he's really disorganized, he has notes that are scattered all over the place, his binder's a mess, he doesn't have a planner, he kind of goes on his own, kind of does whatever. That could obviously hurt. He might not submit his essay on time, he might forget to submit it entirely, he might forget to write it, wait to the last second. So if you wanted to flip this and say, Shamar exhibits low conscientiousness, you could easily do that. That would hurt him. Again, you could also do the more obvious and state that he has high conscientiousness and then apply it from the help, as my example down here shows. But please, if you see a bullet where it says Big 5 trait of, that of means they will pick one of the 5 and you can only write about that one. Don't waste numerous sentences. I mean, we're talking about a dozen sentences you could waste here, talking about any of the other ones. Not agreeableness, not neuroticism, not openness, not extroversion, none of them. Only conscientiousness. The final bullet was the frontal lobe, which is one of the 4 lobes in your cerebral cortex. You have the occipital lobe responsible for vision, the temporal lobe responsible for auditory processing, your parietal lobe responsible for the sense of touch, and then your frontal lobe, which is responsible for a few different things you could have referenced. One of them is movement. The frontal lobe contains your motor cortex, so that's one element. It's also responsible for high-level cognitive functioning. We're talking about things like judgment. We're talking about things like planning. Technically, your frontal lobe also contains Broca's area, which is responsible for speech production. It's unlikely that you could have answered this bullet by focusing on Broca's area, but it's not impossible. I think it's way more practical, though, to identify one of these 2 functions. Like, for example, you would be able to physically walk to the office to submit the essay. That would be a great example of movement facilitated by the frontal lobe. I'm kind of running out of space, so I'm not going to write it. But theoretically, your frontal lobe can initiate movement like typing. Let's say your essay is written. You would need to have a functioning frontal lobe to guide the mouse and actually submit it even electronically. So if you were able to describe movement that would go along with writing and submitting the essay, totally works. You would also need high-level functioning in order to actually, on a cognitive level, write a coherent and well-thought-out essay. You would also need to be able to plan your time accordingly in terms of scheduling a time in your day to write the essay and then subsequently submit it. So if you were to reference anything regarding movement or anything regarding high-level cognitive functioning, I think that would be sufficient. You could also discuss how the function of the judgment that the frontal lobe facilitates could be embedded into the essay. Really well thought out high-level essays are going to have a ton of frontal lobe activity. So any of those I think would have been sufficient. Theoretically, the Broca's area is part of the frontal lobe, and if you really stretched, maybe you could have applied it. Like maybe you need to ask somebody for directions to the secretary's office. If you did not have a functioning Broca's area, that might be challenging because you wouldn't be able to move your mouth sufficiently to actually produce the words necessary. So there's not inconceivable that you could have approached it from this one, but that's a little bit more of a stretch. These two are the more obvious approaches to the FRQ.